Good afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to another edition of Oilfield Strong webinar. As you all know, we post these on our YouTube channel, and you can go onto YouTube and look at Oilfield Strong, and that'll take you to this video and then a variety of other videos that you'll be able to see. As you all know, OTA Environmental Solutions does all things emissions, from equipment to field service to environmental consulting. And so it's of specific importance, this conversation about what's happening in New Mexico. As you know, the legislature just finished up. And so today, very, very fortunate to have two, should I say, experts in what's happened in the legislature this past year. Chris Mitton, who is with Civitas as governmental affairs advisor, and then Stephen Robertson, who's executive VP of Permian Basin Petroleum Association, both very active in the New Mexico market and the legislature. And so I think today will be a great opportunity to get an overview of what's going on or what happened in the legislature and what to look forward to. So with that, let me just start off with kind of a general question, Chris or Stephen. Kind of how do you think it went? What are some of the big takeaways from the legislature?
Stephen, you want to take that first?
Sure, Chris, I appreciate it. And Grant, thank you for having us. We always appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to your audience. We know that the world that Chris and I work in when it comes to government affairs is not always the world that everybody out there listening to this works in. So we're going to try not to use too many acronyms and get off into too many areas that are a little bit more government focused to understand, to really try to help people figure out what happened this session. As with so many sessions in New Mexico, it has to be viewed through the scope of, you don't always get the opportunity to accomplish a lot of positive, but what all negative can you prevent? That's kind of the way that we approach legislative sessions in New Mexico. And as a reminder, this was the second legislative session for this group of legislators, actually moving forward this year, this summer, I think in June. Every member of the House and the Senate in New Mexico will be up for election in their primaries. And so for all the elected officials over there, this was kind of their last chance to accomplish something with this specific group of legislators. And the session started off with 3 different interruptions of the governor's state of state presentation at the Roundhouse. The protests were maybe about a little bit to do with what we do for a living, but a lot to do about a lot of other issues. And that just kind of set the table for what we were going to deal with. And in that sense, it was kind of a divisive session from the beginning, a little bit more so in particular than the last few years. And so we had to work very closely with our friends like Chris and like other folks in the industry, other trade associations, to really accomplish what we needed to accomplish this session. From a 30,000-foot view, I think we were successful. I mean, there were some issues that we had to deal with throughout that had to result in some last minute calls of everybody trying to get together and figuring out, okay, how do we feel about this new proposal or this new language or this new revision that they are trying to put into this piece of legislation that didn't have anything to do with the oil and gas industry until 2 hours ago. And so it was definitely a challenge. It was a challenge that we look forward to undertaking. Really appreciate the help and the support that we get from our members. We sure couldn't do it without them. Chris was absolutely front and center in so many of those conversations and helped make this a pretty good session for industry, in the sense of we were able to fend off some pretty bad proposals out there to really be able to try to protect operations in the state moving forward.
Well, Stephen, I think that was a great overview, and I think you hit on some of the key points that really resonated with us at Civitas this year. Is being the first year in New Mexico, really grateful for our partnership with the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and all the other members of both associations, really welcoming us into New Mexico and the basin, and helping us get up to speed on kind of some of the issues. Being a Colorado-based company up until last year, we've had our own challenges and legislative battles to be dealing with. And so we're hoping to bring some of our expertise and lessons learned from the trials and tribulations in Colorado down to New Mexico. One of the things, the benefits for us being a new member and being a new operator in the state was we had a lot of opportunities to really talk about Civitas, who we are, how we operate, our focus and commitment to being a good state and local partner to our regulators, to the communities in which we operate, and really being able to kind of, again, talk about the things that we want to do in the long term in New Mexico, which is always an easier conversation with legislators. So we enjoyed some of that pre-session, and then it was interesting. 30-day sessions, that's not something that I'm typically used to. My background is primarily in federal affairs, where a conversation about a bill title might take 30 days versus having to pass almost considering 600 pieces of legislation and passing about 70 bills in 30 days. It speaks to the efficiency there in New Mexico. So, as Stephen said, we worked really well with the industry. There was a lot of very interesting pieces of legislation out there, some good, some bad. But ultimately, we see, we think that the resolution at the end of session was positive for the industry, and look forward to the interim and working with industry partners for a successful 2025 as well.
So, Stephen, you mentioned sometimes your success is judged by what you were able to prevent, and it seemed like there were quite a few failed efforts from looking at the Oil and Gas Act, increasing royalties, the water act, bill that the governor was bringing out. Can you kind of discuss some of the things that was a positive by being a negative?
Yeah, I think the one that is probably the easiest to talk about right off the bat, because it's been an effort going back to Chris's mention of how long processes can take in different legislatures and how a 30-day session really doesn't seem like it gives you much time. Oftentimes what happens in New Mexico is a bill or a resolution will get introduced one session with probably great hopes by its author and sponsors, but with a knowledge that it's likely just laying the foundation to try to bring this resolution or bill back up another legislative session. And so there's several of those efforts that we saw go around this time. In particular, the one the easiest to talk about, I'd say, is the activity, the option, the resolution that gets known as the Green Amendment. And I think for the third legislative session in a row, the Green Amendment was brought up and again defeated in committee in New Mexico. It's something that I think is also something that's interesting, and I don't know how unique it is, but it's relatively unique in New Mexico, is when a bill or a resolution gets brought up, it can get referred to multiple different committees in each different chamber of the legislature, and it has to make it out of those committees to be able to make it back to the floor. In comparison to the way that things work on other states that maybe border with New Mexico, without naming those states specifically, those legislatures usually just refer the bills to one committee in the House or the Senate. It gets reviewed there, it gets discussed there, testimony is taken there, and then the bill is voted back to the floor with a recommendation. And so in New Mexico, there's several different hurdles that an option might have to go through before it can make it back. And so when a bill doesn't make it out of the first committee that it goes to, that's a pretty good sign there's not a lot of support for that effort. And for the second session in a row, the Green Amendment died in the first committee that it was brought up. And not only did it not make it out of that committee, the industry didn't even have to stand up and discuss the bill. To kind of give a small overview of that bill, basically it would give everyone in the state, regardless of any kind of property ownership, citizenship, the right to a clean environment without defining what a clean environment is. But roughly coming along with that would be the right to stand in the way of any government project that a person felt interfered with their right to a clean environment. And so every business in the state is threatened. Every construction project in the state is threatened. And the business community and construction community, which also includes renewable energy, the unions see this as a negative for the state. And they have fought back against it at the last two legislative sessions. And they've been the ones that really have gotten up and testified to kill that action. So that's one of those that has come up multiple times and continues to get defeated. I would very much project, Chris, that we will see it again next session. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But there were other efforts. Grant, you mentioned the Oil and Gas Act. There were changes proposed to the Oil and Gas Act that really started well before the session, in kind of working groups that were established through the Oil Conservation Division. in New Mexico to try to figure out if there was a proposal that everyone could get behind. And by everyone, it meant not just the oil and gas industry, but the environmental industry and the environmental world as well. That is an incredibly tall task, and it didn't happen. I don't know what exactly you could have resulted in that could have gotten everybody on the same page, but it was a Herculean effort put together by Deputy Secretary Fuge to try to find something to push forward. He was tasked with trying to do this, and I think that people in the industry would agree there are necessary updates and changes that need to happen to the Oil and Gas Act. The difficulty tends to happen. They sprinkle in 3 or 4 of the necessary changes and then throw in 3 or 4 changes that everybody in industry is like, if you do that, you're going to kill the industry. And in particular, with these efforts, one of the aspects of that, which then saw itself surface in other memorials during the session as well, was to try to incorporate required setbacks of all oil and gas facilities in the state without really defining what a facility was. So it was our understanding, it was even questioned in committee, that would include a natural gas flow line that would go to a residential building or to an office building. And so you are requiring setbacks from even those type of facilities, which basically means you can't have any kind of construction anywhere close to any kind of construction that already exists. And fortunately, there were people in the legislature that saw that for the threat that it was and helped to get that aspect stripped out of the Oil and Gas Act changes. But there were other concerns we had as well. PBPA, NMOGA, IPA&M genuinely, I think, tried to work with the administration, tried to work with the sponsors of the bill to fight to get something that we ultimately, if we couldn't support, could at least get to neutral on. Unfortunately, some of the trades that they would have had to make to get industry there resulted in them losing a lot of the support from the environmental community. And so by the time the bill was really getting ready for prime time, it was on shaky grounds, and it ended up making it to the House floor, but it didn't make it any further than that. Again, however, though, I think that'll be something that we see probably come back up again next session. And there will be several interim committee meetings and hearings and testimony taken between now and then to really try to refine the effort and get it to be something that we are going to probably have a difficult time trying to fight back, even if it has some warts on it that we don't like next go around. Those are just 2 actions. There was a lot of other actions out there. I'm going to give Chris a little bit of opportunity to jump in there, though, and see if he has anything in particular that may have been of interest to Civitas that came up this session.
Well, that setback that you talked about sure seemed to smell of kind of Colorado, and because they've done the setback as well. Is that true, Chris? Are they just kind of replicating some of that, or how do you see all that? And then add whatever else you might.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. It's a great question. I think we are starting to see some of the similar sorts of legislative proposals in New Mexico that Colorado has championed or passed over the last 5 or 6 years. In Colorado, Senate Bill 181 was really kind of the first big piece of legislation to really change the landscape for oil and gas operations in Colorado, and has been something that the environmental community has kind of tried to replicate across the country. As it relates specifically to setbacks, one of the unique things in Colorado is that each individual county or local jurisdiction, even cities, are able to implement their own setback requirements, which makes for very difficult planning and operations for us here in Colorado. So some uniform statewide setback requirement is something that we would be more attuned to in New Mexico, and something that we think would be better for the industry as well as for localities to provide that certainty for investments, as well as providing some ease of implementation as well. I think, Stephen, you covered a lot of the really big things for 133. That was definitely took a lot of my time during the session. I think the only thing that I would add is, 2 things, I guess, is we agree at Civitas that there are some reasonable changes in modernization provisions to the Oil and Gas Act, and look forward to working with industry, our trade association partners in the administration on finding what that balance is. One of the things I learned early in my career the best negotiations end when both sides aren't happy and a resolution is out, the outcome is delivered. So I think we're going to all have to walk away from the table at some point with some things that we don't like, but finding the way that we can continue to produce in the state and provide the financial resources to the state so they can continue to provide the services needed is essential for us. And the only other thing that, Stephen, was early on in the 133 was the produced water and fresh water restrictions. This is something Governor Lujan Grisham has really focused on. She made a large announcement at the COP28, conference earlier in the year, and it was something that she really wanted to get through. I think this is something we'll continue to see. It's becoming more of an issue in the Permian. It's even starting to become an issue for us up in the DJ Basin, where the produced water is significantly less than even in the Permian. And so we'll continue to see this, and what the ultimate solution is, I think will hopefully be driven by industry and the investments they're making, both from a technological perspective, but also in terms of reuse and recycling. So something we're going to continue to monitor very closely in New Mexico.
Well, you say that if you look at some of these bills, and if they don't pass, it's an indicator of what's to come. And in the Oil and Gas Act, there were increases in fines and penalties. There were increases in bonding requirements. So it seems like from a financial standpoint, they're really looking to find ways to extract more cash out of the oil and gas industry and put a little more pressure on the bonding side.
Yeah, and Grant, on that point, while there's I think valuable conversation to have around the bonding aspect of that in particular, because of the fact that New Mexico has grown tremendously over the last several years in amount of production in the state. And as we all know, and Grant, you and I have had this conversation before, and talking to people outside the industry, people will ask the question, well, when you drill a well, which wells are more likely to become abandoned wells than other wells? And the answer is every well ultimately gets to the point that it is going to have an end life. There is no well that produces forever. And so there does need to be a comprehensive strategy in place to be able to take care of those assets at the end of their life. And I don't think anybody in the industry is opposed to that. I think part of the difficulty that we have is what is the real end game of those proposals, and what is the purpose of the specific amounts in certain fees or fines or bond amounts? I mean, when you look at the state of New Mexico in particular in 2023, the oil and gas industry generated, I think, somewhere around $7.5 billion of revenue for the state. The entire state's budget that was just passed and sent to the governor was just over $10 billion. And so the oil and gas industry sends a lot of money to the state to accomplish a lot of things for the state, whether it's education, whether it's roads, whether it's other infrastructure projects, whether it's healthcare. And so there tends to be an approach, if not at least an accusation from those that are looking at these numbers and kind of asking some questions of, okay, what really is the point of raising these fees? Like, what are you going to be doing with this extra money when you've already got all of this money in the first place, and you can't even really find ways to spend it appropriately? And so is the point really that you need the money to do the well closures in the field, or is it something else? And I think that becomes a difficulty in trying to really understand where people's motives are at and what's driving the conversation. But we as an association, I think the members of our association, the industry, absolutely want to be the best stewards that we can be of our assets, of the communities we work in, and of the land that we impact. And we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to leave the landscape, leave the communities a better place than they started. And one of the talking points that we don't hear often enough, and I get it because it's kind of it's too broad of a view, but the reality is the world is better off with oil and gas in it and being the primary fuel source for so much of what we do. Before, hydrocarbons of every sort, including coal, natural gas, oil, were used as a primary fuel source, over 80% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, because of those fuels, less than 8% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty. We provide for ways to clean water. We provide for ways to clean air that didn't exist before. But that doesn't mean we can't do better. And we do want to continue to work to always improve our operations.
Well, it seems like we potentially get in a vicious cycle where they kind of try to punish or penalize, especially the smaller wells. But if you're not careful, you're going to punish them into inactivity, and then they become orphaned, and then you create another issue. And so it's kind of some of those penalties and some of those fines, they're going to, it seems like to me, you're almost creating a whole nother issue that might even be worse than what you've got before. Because if they're active still, you at least have a chance for that operator to plug it or operate it correctly.
Yeah, and on that exact note, something else that was in HB 133, the Oil and Gas Act changes that we haven't talked about, was limitations from the government side on what assets could be transferred at what times. And that's another area where my antenna went up and flag went up, talking about, okay, well, what is this going to do to the orphan well population? Because if you are telling companies that they can't shed low producing assets to another owner, and they get stuck with that company, then they become a liability for that company. And does that now make that company not able to operate anymore? Now the whole company is going to go bankrupt, and these wells are going to be, I mean, just these kinds of conversations that we need to be able to have an open conversation, not just amongst ourselves, but with legislators, not just the administrative branch of the government, to really have an understanding of this is what some of the fallout for this type of change could be. Let's make sure we aren't opening Pandora's box and putting something in place that people think, oh, this is going to fix the problem, when really all it does is squeeze that tube of toothpaste even more and everything gets out.
So you talk about all these penalties, but then amazingly, if I read it right, there's tax relief for small producers to help some of the smaller guys, which kind of amazed me that New Mexico took that direction, but sounds positive. Do y'all know what that entails and how that's going to play out?
I'm saying, Chris, I'm happy to jump on that. I know I've talked a bunch, so I don't
You're
know.
good. I honestly was not tracking that bill that much,
Okay.
so please.
So yeah, so one of the full charge of the legislature in a session like this, a 30-day session in New Mexico, is just to pass a budget. It's to update the budget from one year to the other. Anything else that they talk about is only supposed to be discussed because it's been at the special call of the governor, or if it happened to be a bill that was passed by both branches, and since the governor, but she vetoed it last session, well, then they can bring it back up again this session. But along with the budget comes tax concerns. And so there was two main bills that were passed. One was the larger appropriations bill, and the other was an adjustment to income tax brackets, which was HB 252. And in that, it included several different provisions that allowed for some tax exemptions on severance taxes for producers. They had to meet several different requirements. And a lot of that had to do with satisfying the not recent as in the last few months, but the last few years put in place methane rules at OCD and ozone precursor rules in the Environment Department. But there are opportunities out there. They also don't kick in unless oil is at specific values. So if oil and gas stay at high prices, and I know that oil is staying a lot higher than natural gas has been lately, but if they stay at higher prices, then these never really factor in. But you're absolutely right, Grant. For the fact that they even passed something that would be a benefit to the industry, I think is a big positive.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I want you to put your psychic hat on, because you talk about things in the session and how it's going to go forward. But then I also I'm going to two-part question. It's I saw Secretary Kinney talk about how 15% of the production is under a consent decree in New Mexico, and that they've got 80 investigations going. So mush all that together and tell me how this is going to play out. Is all of New Mexico going to be under a consent decree, and some of these things that failed earlier are now going to we're going to see it again in a year and have a better chance of passing? How about that for a loaded question?
Yeah, exactly. Give it to the new guy, right? So, I think from our perspective, we will see a lot of these types of bills again in 2025, whether it's a rewrite of HB 133, which was the Oil and Gas Act changes, whether it's some narrower amalgamation of specific issues on that, from 98% gas capture to bonding or something like that, we will see additional legislation on oil and gas next year. We hope that it's not similar to the session that we're facing up here in Colorado, and it's more of a partnership working with our legislative friends, the folks in the administration, and the folks in the environmental community. Again, as Stephen said earlier, I think there are reasonable modernization changes that we can make to the Oil and Gas Act that the industry would be willing to get to the table on and discuss. As it relates to kind of other pieces of legislation, I think we'll continue to see things on the produced water side. Methane will continue to be, an issue, whether it's codifying the administration's 98% gas capture. There were some studies, memorials proposed by the legislature this year looking at, studying methane more closely and more intently. I think there's so much action at the federal level on that, from Quad OB, from the waste emissions charge, and the rewrite of Subpart W, which I apologize is very weedy, but it's all part of a very large package of methane rules coming down from the federal government that is going to change the way that oil and gas operates across the country. So, from our perspective, let's kind of see how those rules are implemented, and then see if there's reasons to nibble around the edges on different changes from there. So those are kind of what we're looking towards for 2025. As it relates to the first half of your question, boy, I hope not. I really hope that the rest of the 80% of operators aren't under a consent decree. And, I think the secretary has taken a little bit closer look at some of the operators in the state. And, that's the outcome that we have seen. We will hope that Civitas and our new ownership of the assets down there are not in that situation, and we strive to provide our operations in the cleanest, most responsible way. Our number one priority here in Colorado and across all of our asset base is the safety of our employees and of our communities in which we operate, and we strive for operational excellence every day, much like I know the rest of the industry does as well. And so, I think we will continue as an industry to make strides in improving our operational efficiency, the safety of our employees and the communities. And I look forward to kind of seeing what's ahead for the industry in 2024 and beyond.
I combined Secretary Kenny's comment about 80 companies under investigation. I combined that with the increase in their budget, the environmental budget, by 26% up to like over 200 million. And to me, that kind of scares me a little bit that they're got them under investigation, and now they're funding the environmental departments even more to go to enforce, to go after whatever. Those are my words, not y'all's words. But Stephen, any comment on that? I know that's a tricky one to.
Well,
I can say some things that y'all probably can't say. So.
I would say, and Grant, to take a pivot. You mentioned the numbers. One of the really interesting kind of conversations that happened publicly during this session that we hadn't really talked about yet, and it didn't have a huge impact on what passed, but it sure, I think, made a huge impact on HB 133 not passing, even though it wasn't even on the table at the time this conversation was going on. It's early on in the session. Representatives from the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department were presenting their proposed budget to Senate Finance, something that happens every single session, especially during these budget-specific sessions, trying to make the arguments why we need more full-time employees, or why we need more money for this program or that program, or what we need to do over here. And so the MNERD was presenting their proposed budget and their request, and the chair for the Senate Finance Committee looked at him and said, well, that's fantastic. But why are you going to need any money for your department if you get rid of the industry that you're trying to regulate with the passage of HB 133? Because at that point in time, they still had the setbacks requirement in it. And somebody had provided him with a map showing that if they don't define what facility they're talking about better than they're doing right now, and it really is this 1.5 miles to everything, here is the map of New Mexico where you are not going to be able to do anything. And it was roughly something like 70% of the state. And so they got it very quickly. And so they understand where the money comes from for that state to be able to accomplish so many things. in certain parts of the state. And it doesn't matter if you're on the Republican side of the aisle or the Democratic side of the aisle, those in the state charged with trying to help pay for elementary school, junior high, high school education, those helping to pay for rural healthcare, those helping to pay for broadband, getting out to the far stretches of the state of New Mexico, those trying to pay for new road projects, understand that revenue from the oil and gas industry pays for so much of what can be accomplished in the state. And they don't want to cut off their nose to spite their face. Yet they have to have these battles and these conversations with other interests in the state that don't see it as clear cut as that, and don't see it as easy of a decision to make that we want to be able to pay for all of these other services for the state. So we've got to figure out ways to continue to support the oil and gas industry. Instead, it's more of a, okay, what would we put in place that could kill off the oil and gas industry? All right, now let's take a half a step back, and that's what we want to try to pass. It's not about what can we actually do to accomplish and make methane capture better, to make water cleaning or disposal or reuse better. It's about what can we do to keep the oil and gas industry around because we want to use the money, but still increase the regulation on them to the point that we feel better when we go home at night. And it's a difficult environment to operate in. That is, I think, by far and away a minority voice in the state, but it is a very loud voice that makes those arguments. And so it makes the jobs of folks like Chris and I and the other people in the industry trying to advocate for the safe and secure operations of our companies moving forward difficult. It also makes it a fun challenge to approach, and it's great to be able to do it with people like Chris, because it's a joy to get to do the work. You know, people that are problem solvers that really want to find a way forward, that don't just want to put on the earmuffs and just say, nope, this is horrible. There's nothing we can do about it. We just got to go home today, because that's not an option. We've got to continue to fight. The state of New Mexico, the entire Permian Basin, the United States, the world needs what we do, and so we're going to continue to fight for it.
It's so frustrating when you start seeing history repeat itself. And I was active in the San Juan Basin when Governor Richardson was there, and they punished put a lot of regulation that affected the San Juan, and it affected their budget. And so all their education and other ideas they had to be scaled way back. So it's be careful what you ask for, I guess, is the moral of that story. So, well, Chris, Stephen, our time is up. Any final comments?
Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, one thing that we were very encouraged by and we commend the legislature for was some of the historic investments in transportation infrastructure across the state, and specifically some significant investments in the Permian Basin region. One of my first trips down to our new asset base and outside of Jal, New Mexico, I saw the immediate need for some significant increases in transportation funding down there. And that was one of the things that we worked on pretty extensively with the legislature during session this year, was trying to make some discrete investments down in transportation funding. So we're very grateful for the communities to receive that funding. A lot of big safety improvements, new pavement, wider lanes, safer intersections are going to make things a lot better and safer down there for the communities and the people that live there. So we're very proud of the legislature for getting that done, and grateful for their efforts on that.
I think that's a great point. Stephen, last thought?
Yeah, I was going to say, no, I completely agree with Chris. And one of the things that I continue to say about the state of New Mexico is that the most valuable resource there is not what's in the ground, it's the people above the ground that do the work. And if we're not helping to protect them by improving the roads, by improving the healthcare system, by improving the educational system, then we're not taking care of the most valuable resource in that state. And we've got to continue to do that. And absolutely kudos to those legislators that saw those needs and tried to address them this session. Really appreciate their work.
Well, guys, really appreciate y'all's time. And it's kind of nice to go through a legislative session and really not have huge issues or huge negatives affecting the industry. So I think that's compliments to Chris, you, Stephen, like you say, a whole variety of other people that we could list representing the industry. So thank y'all for doing that, and thank y'all for doing this.